The quilt was folded so precisely, so deliberately, that Dorothy Sawyer's hands trembled when she touched it. It was a Tuesday morning in October of 1882, the high desert air of New Mexico territory carrying that particular bite that came before the cold truly settled in, and Dorothy had stepped out onto the porch of the Finley ranch house with nothing more on her mind than checking whether the water barrel needed filling. But the quilt stopped her dead. It sat on the old bent willow chair at the far end of the porch, the one Thomas's father had made before he died, the chair nobody ever sat in because it was understood without words that it belonged to memory. The quilt was arranged on it the way a woman arranges something when she wants it to look like it has always been there. Smoothed corners, a careful fold along the top edge, not tossed, not forgotten, placed. Dorothy's throat closed. She knew every quilt in this house. She had taken inventory of them during her first week here, partly out of habit and partly because she had arrived in October and the nights were already cold, and she had not known whether she was welcome enough to ask for another blanket. There were 3 quilts inside. This was not one of them. She turned around and looked through the window into the kitchen, and there was Margaret Finley, Thomas's mother, standing at the stove with her back deliberately turned, stirring something that did not need stirring, her narrow shoulders carrying the particular rigidity of a woman who knows she is being watched and has decided to pretend otherwise. Dorothy pressed her hand flat against the quilt. The fabric was old but clean, the hexagonal patches in shades of rust and cream and the deep blue of a stormy sky. Somebody had loved this quilt, somebody had kept it. And now it was here, on this porch, in October of 1882, 8 weeks after Dorothy Sawyer had arrived as a stranger in the territory of New Mexico, and 6 weeks after she had understood, with a certainty that felt like swallowing a stone, that Thomas Finley did not want her here. She sat down on the porch steps and pressed the quilt against her chest and let herself, just for 1 minute, fall entirely apart. Because this small, impossible kindness from a woman who had spent 2 months looking past her, around her, through her, was almost harder to bear than the hostility had been. The hidden warmth was its own kind of pain. The pretense that the quilt had always been there, that it was nothing, that it required no acknowledgement, that Dorothy did not need to feel grateful or seen or confused, was the most careful and complicated gift anyone had ever given her in 24 years of living. And standing in that kitchen, stirring nothing, was the mother of a man Dorothy was slowly, devastatingly, despite every intention to the contrary, falling in love with. Which was the problem? Which was the entire catastrophic problem? 12 weeks earlier, Dorothy Sawyer had been in Abilene, Kansas, and her life had been in ruins. She was 24 years old, which was old enough to know better and young enough to have not yet learned what better even looked like. She had grown up in the eastern part of Kansas, the daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had died of fever when Dorothy was 11, and she had spent the years since raising herself and helping raise her 2 younger brothers in the kind of quiet, competent, invisible way that women do when there is no one else available for the job. Her father had remarried when Dorothy was 17, a perfectly decent woman named Agnes who had no particular need of Dorothy's competence or her invisible labor, and Dorothy had found herself suddenly, startlingly, unnecessary. She had gone to Abilene at 20 with the idea of becoming a schoolteacher herself. She had succeeded, after a fashion. She had taught at the Abilene School for 4 years, lived in a boarding house on Wheeler Street, and saved money in the methodical, joyless way of someone who has learned not to expect joy, but has not given up entirely on security. She had been sensible and quiet and precisely the kind of woman who is described as dependable rather than beautiful, practical rather than charming, and who is spoken of with respect by people who never think of her when she is not in front of them. Then the school had hired a new headmaster, a man named Gerald Potts, who was neither sensible nor dependable but who possessed a spectacular talent for making himself appear to be both. He had charm that worked like a confidence trick, bright and convincing and hollow at the center. Dorothy, who had spent 24 years being practical, had not recognized charm for what it was because she had so little practice with it. She had thought she loved him. She had trusted him with information she should not have trusted anyone with, least of all a man she had known for 8 months. Specifically, she had told him about the small inheritance her mother had left her, held in a Kansas City bank, $430 that Dorothy had never touched because she was saving it for a genuine emergency. Gerald Potts had decided to constitute himself as that emergency. He had borrowed the money in March, on the premise that he needed to send it to his ailing mother in Ohio, and by April he had simply stopped being in Abilene. The headmaster position had lasted until May, at which point the school board had discovered that Gerald Potts was not in fact a licensed teacher and had never finished his education past the 7th grade. He had simply been very convincing. Dorothy had not reported the loss to anyone because the shame of it sat in her chest like something physical and hot, and because there was nothing useful to report. She had lent the money of her own volition to a man she had chosen to trust. The law was not particularly interested in foolish women. By July she had sold every non-essential item she owned and paid off her outstanding debts with what remained, and she had sat in her room at the boarding house on Wheeler Street and faced the fact that she had, at 24, precisely nothing. Her father had written in June, a careful and well-meaning letter that managed to convey, without saying it directly, that there was not room for her to come home to Agnes's house. Her brothers were grown and in their own lives. There was no one to go back to. She had seen the advertisement in the Abilene Chronicle on a Thursday in July. Wanted, a woman of good character and strong constitution to assist on a working cattle ranch in the territory of New Mexico. Correspondence welcomed. References required. Applied to Thomas Finley, Cielo Rojo Ranch, Sanger County, New Mexico Territory. It was not an advertisement for a wife. This was the first thing that struck her. It was an advertisement for someone who could work. She had written to him, carefully and honestly, with her schoolteacher's handwriting and without any particular attempt to present herself as more than she was. She had said she was 24. She had said she was strong and capable of hard work. She had said she had experience managing a household, keeping accounts, and teaching children. She had included a reference from her former landlady, Mrs. Pittman, who was the most honest person Dorothy had ever met. Thomas Finley had written back in 3 weeks. His letter was not warm exactly, but it was not cold either. It was precise. He wrote that the ranch required someone reliable for a period of not less than 1 year, to help manage the household accounts and assist his mother, who was recovering from an illness, and to take over certain organizational responsibilities that had become overwhelming during the illness. He offered a salary of $9 a month, room and board provided. He said he was 30 years old, that the ranch covered 1,200 acres in the high desert near the Sanger de Cristo foothills, and that the nearest town of consequence was Myra Wells, 7 miles distant. He did not say he was lonely. He did not say that his father had died 6 months ago. He did not say that his mother's illness had been grief as much as anything physical. He did not say that he had been running a cattle operation largely alone since January, and that the accounts were not just overwhelming but genuinely alarming. He did not say any of the things she would later learn were most true about his situation. But he wrote like a man who meant what he said, and Dorothy, who had just been spectacularly deceived by a man who had not meant a single word, found this more compelling than she could have explained. She had taken the train from Abilene to Santa Fe and the stagecoach from Santa Fe to Myra Wells, and Thomas Finley had met her at the stage office on a Thursday morning in August, the sun already ferocious at 9 o'clock. She had known him immediately, which surprised her because she had not known what she was looking for. He was tall, built in the particular lean, sun-weathered way of men who work outdoors in dry country, with dark hair that needed cutting and brown eyes that were doing the same assessment of her that she was doing of him. He wore a work shirt and practical boots and no gun, which she would later learn was unusual for him, and which he had decided on that morning because he did not want to seem threatening to a woman arriving alone in a strange territory. He had said Miss Sawyer and offered his hand, and she had shaken it and said Mr. Finley, and they had looked at each other for 3 seconds that contained, without either of them knowing it yet, the entire shape of what was going to happen to them. He had said, "The wagon is out front," and she had said, "I have 2 trunks," and he had said, "That's fine." And that had been their entire conversation for the first 20 minutes because he drove and she sat beside him, and they were both people who did not talk when they had nothing particular to say. She had noticed, during that 7-mile ride through country that was nothing like Kansas and impossibly beautiful in its severity, that his hands on the reins were capable and unhurried. She noticed that he checked the sky in the way of someone who has learned to read weather. She noticed that when a hawk circled low over the road, he watched it with something that was not quite a smile but was close to one. She had thought, sitting in that wagon in August of 1882, that she was going to be all right. The ranch was beautiful in the way that beautiful things sometimes are when they have been made by hard work rather than by chance. The main house was solid adobe with a long front porch, surrounded by a kitchen garden and a small orchard of fruit trees that were the obvious project of someone who cared about permanence. The outbuildings were in good repair. The horses in the corral were well kept. Everything spoke of a place that had been taken seriously. Margaret Finley had come out to the porch when they pulled up, and Dorothy had understood immediately, with the social precision that comes from a lifetime of navigating difficult domestic situations, that this woman was not glad to see her. Margaret was 52, not particularly tall, with white hair she wore pinned severely back and eyes that were the same brown as her son's but engaged in a fundamentally different project with them. Where Thomas's eyes were assessing, Margaret's were protective. She was not hostile in any way that could be named. She was simply watching Dorothy the way you watch something you are not sure is safe. She had said, "Welcome to Cielo Rojo," in a voice that was perfectly pleasant and completely without welcome, and Dorothy had said, "Thank you, Mrs. Finley, it's a beautiful place," and Margaret had said, "I'll show you your room," and that had been that. The room was small and clean at the far end of the house from Thomas's room, with a window that looked out toward the mountains. There was one quilt on the bed, a simple one in shades of brown and gold. Dorothy had put her things away and gone to find out what was needed of her. What was needed of her turned out to be a great deal. The accounts were not just alarming, as she had suspected from Thomas's letter, but genuinely frightening in several of their particulars. There were outstanding debts with the feed merchant in Myra Wells going back to February. There was a note on the ranch property itself, held by the Territorial Bank in Santa Fe, with a payment due in January that Thomas did not currently have the resources to meet. The household accounts had been kept, during Margaret's illness in the spring, in Thomas's handwriting, which was clear but not organized. The records of a practical man doing his best with something he had not been trained for. Dorothy sat down with those accounts on her 3rd day at Cielo Rojo and spent 6 hours working through them. And at the end of those 6 hours, she knew 3 things. She knew the ranch was not in danger of failing if certain decisions were made carefully and quickly. She knew that Thomas Finley was a better cattleman than he was an accountant, but that he was not stupid about money, only untrained. And she knew that the death of his father in January, coming as it had in the dead of winter, had coincided with a period of drought that had forced him to purchase additional feed at inflated prices just to keep the cattle alive, and that this was the origin of the debt to the feed merchant, and that it was the kind of cascading bad luck that was nobody's fault and could happen to anyone. She had brought him the accounts that evening after supper, laid out on 3 sheets of paper with the problems clearly marked, and several possible approaches to each problem noted in her careful handwriting. He had looked at them for a long time without speaking. Then he had looked up at her and said, How? And she had explained her reasoning, and he had asked questions that were sharp and sensible, and she had answered them. And by the end of the conversation, they had a plan that was not comfortable but was workable. And Thomas Finley was looking at her the way a man looks at something he has not expected and does not quite know what to do with. He had said, "Thank you, Miss Sawyer." And she had said, "This is what I'm here for, Mr. Finley." And she had gone to bed feeling something she had not felt in a long time, which was the satisfaction of being useful. But the situation was complicated in ways that had nothing to do with the accounts. The complication was that Dorothy had not come to Cielo Rojo intending to feel anything about Thomas Finley beyond professional regard, and Thomas had not placed that advertisement intending to feel anything about whoever answered it beyond gratitude for competent help. And they were both discovering, with increasing discomfort, that their intentions were not entirely in control of the situation. It happened in small ways, and then in larger ways, and then all at once, the way these things always do. It happened when she saw him with the ranch's horses, the gentle certainty of him, the way the animals turned toward him, the way that well-treated things always turn toward the people who treat them well. It happened when she heard him telling his mother, quietly in the kitchen, that things were going to be all right, and the quality of his voice when he said it, which was the quality of someone who believes what he is saying because he has decided to. It happened when she asked him one evening why the orchard, why plant fruit trees in this particular dry and difficult landscape, and he had been quiet for a moment and then said, "My mother planted them. Said if you're going to live somewhere hard, you should have something sweet." She had looked at him when he said that and found him looking back at her, and they had both looked away at almost the same moment. The complication was also that Margaret Finley, watching all of this with the careful attention of a mother who knows her son, was frightened. Not of Dorothy, precisely. She was frightened of what Dorothy represented. She was frightened because Thomas had been devastated, in the particular quiet way of quietly devastated men, by his father's death, and he had pulled himself closed around that grief like pulling a house shut against a storm. And Margaret had watched him for 8 months becoming more and more interior, more and more insulated, more and more alone, and she had been frightened about what that kind of solitude could do to a person over years. And now Dorothy was here, and Margaret could see, with the clarity of a woman who has loved one man very deeply for 32 years and watched him die in February, that her son was in the early stages of falling in love with a woman he had hired to manage his accounts. This frightened her for a different reason than it might have. The reason it frightened her was not that Dorothy was not worthy. Margaret was honest enough with herself to know, by the end of September, that Dorothy was in fact remarkably worthy. She was not frightened because Dorothy was a threat. She was frightened because she had not decided yet whether to stop being frightened. And fear, once it has settled into the body of a woman who has recently lost everything she trusted, is not a simple thing to relocate. Margaret had, in her own way, loved her son so fiercely, and for so long that she sometimes could not tell where her protection of him ended and her fear of loss began. She had lost her husband. She could not bear the idea of watching her son make a mistake that would cost him the kind of peace he deserved. She was not sure yet whether Dorothy Sawyer was a mistake, so she watched. And she was cooler than she needed to be, and more distant than she wanted to be. And Dorothy, who had been trying for 2 months to read the situation and had not been able to, had taken the coolness at face value and assumed she was unwanted. Which brought them, 8 weeks later, to October and the quilt on the porch chair. Margaret had made that quilt. She had made it in the 2nd year of her marriage in the winter of 1854 in Missouri, before they had come west. It was a grandmother's flower garden pattern, and she had used fabric from her own mother's dresses and her husband's old shirts and the remnants of Thomas's first baby clothes. It was the most personal thing she owned that could be held in the hands. She had taken it out of the cedar chest in her bedroom the night before and sat with it for a long time. She had been watching Dorothy at supper that evening. She had watched the way Thomas passed the bread to Dorothy before he served himself, which he had not done even for his own mother for as long as Margaret could remember. She had watched the way Dorothy laughed, suddenly and genuinely, at something Thomas said, a real laugh that transformed her face into something undefended and bright, and the way Thomas looked at her when she laughed, with an expression so unguarded that Margaret had looked quickly away because it felt private. She had gone to bed and lain awake, and had what she would later think of as a conversation with her husband, the kind of conversation you have with someone who is gone, where you do most of the talking and you answer for them as honestly as you can because you knew them well enough to know what they would say. What her husband would have said was that Thomas was not a child who needed to be protected from feeling things. What her husband would have said was that a woman who could look at a devastating set of accounts and find a solution, who could spend 8 weeks in a difficult household without complaint, who could laugh like that, like she had forgotten for a moment to be careful, was probably not a mistake. What her husband would have said was that Margaret was not actually afraid of Dorothy Sawyer hurting Thomas. She was afraid of Dorothy Sawyer helping Thomas be happy, because if he was happy it meant the world was still capable of that. And if the world was still capable of that, then what were they supposed to do with grief? She had gotten up at 5 in the morning and taken the quilt from the cedar chest and carried it out to the porch and arranged it on the bent willow chair with such care that her hands were shaking when she finished. And then she had gone into the kitchen to make breakfast and had stood at the stove and stirred things that did not need stirring and waited. Dorothy found the quilt at 7:30. Margaret heard the porch boards creak under her step, and then the creak stopped, and there was a silence that lasted long enough that Margaret put down the spoon and closed her eyes. When Dorothy came inside 20 minutes later, her eyes were slightly red and her posture had the particular careful quality of someone who has been crying and has stopped and does not intend to mention it. And she said, "Good morning, Mrs. Finley," in a voice that was only slightly uneven, and she went to the kitchen table and sat down and began working through the mail that had come the day before. Margaret said good morning and put the coffee on and did not say anything else, and after a moment Dorothy said, without looking up from the mail, "The quilt on the porch chair is beautiful. I haven't seen it before." Margaret said, "It's been there," and went back to the stove. There was a pause of approximately 4 seconds. Dorothy said, "It must keep you warm in the evenings." Margaret said, "It does." And that was that, and neither of them mentioned it again. And the quilt stayed on the chair, and something between them shifted in the direction of honesty, quietly and without ceremony. Thomas did not know about any of this because he had left the house at 5:30 to ride out to the east pasture, where one of the fence lines had been reporting trouble with a particular section of posts that had not been set deep enough in the rocky soil. He was out there alone for most of the morning, working in the particular concentrated way he worked when he was trying not to think about something else. The something else in this case was Dorothy Sawyer. He was 30 years old and he had lived in New Mexico territory for 11 of those years, having come with his parents from Missouri in 1871 when he was 19, and he had in those 11 years built something from almost nothing, which gave him a particular kind of confidence in his own judgment. He trusted himself. He trusted his instincts about cattle, about land, about weather, about the people he hired. He did not trust his instincts about Dorothy Sawyer, because his instincts about Dorothy Sawyer were saying things he was not sure he was ready to hear. He had not placed that advertisement looking for a wife. He had placed it looking for competent help during a difficult period, and he had received that. He had received more than that, and the surplus was the problem. The surplus was the fact that Dorothy at breakfast was something he had started looking forward to. The surplus was the way she argued with him about the account for the Santa Fe Bank, clearly and without anxiety, and was right when she argued, and admitted it when she was wrong. The surplus was the evening last week when the monsoon had come unexpected from the south, and they had both run for the laundry on the line at the same time, and ended up laughing under the porch roof in the rain with her hair coming down, and his shirt soaked through, and he had thought about that evening every day since. He was not a man given to self-deception. He understood that he was in some degree of difficulty. The difficulty was compounded by the fact that he did not know what Dorothy felt. She was professional and warm and sometimes funny, and occasionally, in moments she seemed not to notice, looked at him with an expression he could not entirely decode. She had come here as an employee. She had been deceived before, that much he had gathered from the careful gaps in the little she had told him about Abilene, and he did not know enough of the details to know how badly she had been hurt or how carefully she was guarding herself. He did not want to be another man who took advantage of a woman's circumstances. He had hired her. She was living in his house, dependent on his salary, in a territory where she had no connections and no alternatives. The imbalance of that was something he thought about with a seriousness that would have surprised people who saw only the capable, uncomplicated face he showed the world. He worked on the fence posts until noon and then rode back to the house with nothing resolved except the fence posts. Dorothy was at the kitchen table when he came in, eating bread and reading, and she looked up and said, "I've been waiting to talk to you about the January payment." He hung his hat and sat down across from her and said, "Tell me." She had, in the 3 days since their last conversation about the bank note, identified a solution he had not thought of. There was a rancher in the northern part of the county, a man named Archibald Webb, who had been trying for 2 years to purchase grazing rights on the eastern section of Finley land, specifically a stretch of good grassland along the creek that Thomas rarely used, because it was too far from the main operation to monitor easily. She proposed to sell him a 10-year grazing rights agreement for the sum of $200, which combined with the cattle sale already planned for November, would cover the January payment and leave enough margin to carry them through the spring. Thomas had thought about it while she explained, and he had thought about it for approximately 2 minutes after she finished, and then he had said, "What's the catch?" She had said, "You're giving up the option to expand that way for 10 years. He had said, "I'm not planning to expand that way." She had said, "No, but plans change." He had said, "Everything could be different in 10 years. She had said, "Yes," and looked at him in a way that suggested they were possibly talking about more than one thing. He had said, "Do it," meaning the grazing rights, meaning probably also the other thing, and gone to wash up for the midday meal. Thomas rode to Myra Wells the following Wednesday to speak with Archibald Webb, who was in fact very willing to discuss the grazing rights, and who came back to Cielo Rojo 2 days later with a lawyer from the county seat, and the deal was completed by the end of October. Dorothy drafted the terms, which the lawyer reviewed and found fully competent, and Webb was so impressed by the clarity of the agreement that he asked Thomas where he had found his legal counsel, and Thomas said that his household manager had drafted it, and Webb had looked at Dorothy with something between surprise and respect and said, "You've got a good one." And Thomas had said, "Yes," with a conviction that had nothing to do with legal documents. That evening, after Webb and his lawyer had gone, Thomas and Dorothy were alone on the porch because Margaret had gone to bed early with a headache, and the night was cold and brilliant, the mountains black against the star-crowded sky, and Dorothy had her shawl pulled tight and Thomas had his coffee, and they sat in the old bentwood chairs, the one beside the bent willow chair where the quilt still lived, and were quiet for a while. Then Thomas said, "Can I ask you something?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Why did you answer my advertisement?" She was quiet for a moment, and then she told him. Not everything, not all at once, but more than she had told anyone: the inheritance, the man she had trusted, the $430 gone, the shame of it, the sense of having been made foolish by her own loneliness and inexperience. She told it straightforwardly, without tears, in the precise recounting way of someone who has decided that the facts themselves are not shameful even if the feelings around them are. When she finished, Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He should be in a jail cell." She said, "Yes, but he isn't." He said, "That's not your fault." She said, "I know that, most of the time I know that." He said, "You should know it all of the time." She looked at him, and he was looking back at her with an expression that was not pity, which she could not have borne, but was something closer to anger on her behalf, which felt entirely different. It felt like being seen. She said, "What made you place the advertisement? The real reason?" He looked at the mountains for a moment and then said, "My father died in January. My mother was sick all spring. I was trying to hold everything together, and the accounts were getting away from me. And I knew I needed someone who knew what they were doing. But the truth is I also just needed someone to talk to who wasn't my mother. Because I love my mother, but she was grieving and I was grieving, and we were doing it in the same house, and it was very quiet, and the quiet was getting to be too much." Dorothy said, "I understand quiet, that's too much." He said, "I thought you might." They were quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the kind that is comfortable and does not need filling. He said, "Thank you for what you've done here. The accounts, the web deal, all of it." She said, "It's my job." He said, "It's more than that." She looked at him and looked away and said, "I don't know what it is." He said, "I don't either, but I'd like to find out if you're willing." The sentence sat between them in the cold air, as plain and serious as everything he said, and Dorothy felt something inside her that had been braced for 8 weeks carefully start to unbrace itself, which was frightening and necessary. She said, "I'd like that too." He nodded, like a man who has received important information and intends to treat it carefully, and they sat there until the cold drove them inside, and it was the best evening Dorothy had spent in more than a year. She lay awake in her small room with the mountain window and thought about what being willing actually meant and what it would require of her. And the answer was everything, which was what it always required, which was why it was always the most frightening thing a person could choose. The next 3 weeks moved differently than the previous 8. Not dramatically, not with any sudden change in the surface of daily life, but with a new quality underneath the surface, an awareness between them that had not been named but had been acknowledged, and the acknowledging of it made everything slightly more electric and slightly more careful. Thomas started asking her opinion on things beyond the accounts. He asked what she thought about expanding the cattle operation next spring, whether the market signals out of Santa Fe warranted the investment. He asked whether she thought the East Kitchen garden should be extended to accommodate corn, which she had mentioned in passing one morning and had clearly been thinking about. He asked one evening whether she had ever ridden horses before coming to New Mexico, and when she said not much, he said he would like to teach her if she wanted, and she said she wanted. The riding lessons started on a Sunday in late October, in the corral behind the main barn, on a patient bay mare named Constance, who Thomas described as the most sensible animal on the property, second only to the cattle dog, a large black and tan animal named General who had adopted Dorothy so thoroughly in her first week that he had taken to sleeping outside her bedroom door. The first riding lesson was largely about embarrassment on Dorothy's part and the management of embarrassment on Thomas's. He was kind and precise in his instruction, which she appreciated, and she was a fast learner, which he noticed. And by the second Sunday she was sitting the horse without the constant anxiety of the first lesson, and by the third Sunday she was comfortable enough to ride in a wide circle without Thomas at her elbow. He stood at the center of the corral and watched her ride, and she was aware of being watched and found, this time, that she did not mind. There was something different in the quality of his watching, something that was not just assessment of whether she was doing the thing correctly, but something longer and warmer and more personal. And when she pulled up beside him and said, "How was that?" he looked up at her on the horse and said, "Good," but in a way that contained more than the one word. She had started to feel at home. This was both wonderful and alarming. It was alarming because she had come here as an employee on a 1-year contract, and the year would end in August, and she had not made any plans beyond August because she had not known what August would look like, and she was beginning to understand with a kind of helpless clarity that she did not want to leave. She did not want to leave the ranch with its impossible sky and its severe, generous landscape. She did not want to leave the kitchen garden or the orchard. She did not want to leave General, who was the best dog she had ever known. She did not want to leave the accounts, which were becoming less alarming by the week, and which she had come to think of with a proprietary fondness. She did not want to leave the porch in the evenings, or the way the light fell through the kitchen window at breakfast, or the way Thomas passed her the bread before himself. She did not want to leave Thomas. She thought about this with the careful precision of someone who has been hurt before and has learned to look at her own feelings from all sides before she trusts them. She examined the feeling from every angle she could think of. She asked herself whether she was confusing gratitude with love, whether she was mistaking the relief of safety for something deeper, whether the fact that Thomas was kind and capable and honest was making him seem like more than he was, because she had recently encountered a man who was none of those things. She could not make the feeling smaller than it was. It was what it was. Margaret Finley had been watching all of this with an attention that had lost most of its fear and acquired something more like cautious wonder. She had been watching her son for 30 years. She had watched him grow from a serious, self-contained child into a serious, self-contained man who loved the land with a depth that sometimes worried her because it left so little room for anything else. She had watched him lose his father and grieve in the way of men who have been taught that grief is a private country, quietly and completely and without any exit that she could see. She had been watching him with Dorothy for 3 months now, and what she saw was an exit. She saw it in the way he moved differently in the house, less careful, less contained. She saw it in the fact that he was sleeping better, which she knew because she knew his patterns and they had changed. She saw it in the way he had stopped having that particular look he had developed in the months after his father died, the look of a man who is perpetually bracing for the next thing. She saw it in the way he looked at Dorothy. She had not had a real conversation with Dorothy since the morning of the quilt, and the absence of that conversation had been sitting in her chest like an unfinished thing. She found her moment on a Thursday morning in November, when Thomas had gone to town, and Dorothy was in the kitchen going through the household accounts with her characteristic focused quiet. Margaret made 2 cups of coffee and put one in front of Dorothy and sat down across from her and said, without preamble, "I owe you an apology." Dorothy looked up from the accounts. Margaret said, "I was not welcoming when you arrived. I was not kind when I should have been. I was frightened of something that wasn't your fault, and I let my fear be rude to you, and I am sorry for it." Dorothy was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I understand why. I came here as a stranger during a very hard time. It makes sense that you were careful." Margaret said, "Careful is a generous word for what I was." Dorothy said, "It's the honest one." Margaret said, "You're very fair." Dorothy said, "I'm trying to be." Margaret put her hands around her coffee cup and said, "He is a good man, Thomas. He is, at his core, a fundamentally good man, and those are rarer than people say." Dorothy said, "I know." Margaret said, "I know you know, that's why I wanted to say it out loud." There was a pause, and then Margaret said, "He hasn't been happy in a long time, not since before his father got sick, possibly longer than that. He carries things without putting them down, which is a virtue and a problem in equal measure." Dorothy said, "Yes, I've noticed that." Margaret said, "You're good for him." Dorothy said, carefully, "Mrs. Finley." Margaret said, "I'm not saying it to put pressure on anything. I'm saying it because I want you to know that I see it, and I want you to know that I am glad you're here. Whatever else comes or doesn't come, I'm glad you came." Dorothy looked at her for a long moment, and her eyes were bright in a way that she managed with some effort, and she said, "Thank you. That means more than I can tell you." Margaret said, "The quilt was my mother's pattern and my husband's shirts and Thomas's baby blanket." Dorothy said, "I thought it must have been something like that." Margaret said, "I wanted you to have something warm." Dorothy said, "You did." They drank their coffee, and then Dorothy went back to the accounts and Margaret started the bread, and the kitchen was quiet and comfortable in a way it had not been for a very long time. And this was how Thomas found them when he came back from town 2 hours later, working side by side in a domestic peace that made him stop in the doorway for a moment before he said anything. He said, "Something smells good." His mother said, "Bread, and Dorothy's been fixing the November accounts." Dorothy did not look up, but Thomas saw the edge of her mouth lift. He sat down and waited for the bread and felt something that he recognized after a moment as happiness, which was different from contentment and different from relief and different from the absence of pain. It was its own thing, active and warm, and he had not felt it since before his father died, and he had forgotten what it was like. November moved forward. The cattle sale happened in the second week of the month, in Myra Wells, and the numbers came in slightly above what Dorothy had projected and significantly above what Thomas had hoped, and they stood in the livestock pen in the cold afternoon and looked at the figures, and Dorothy said, "This is good," and Thomas said, "This is better than good." And then, without particularly deciding to do it, he put his arm around her shoulders briefly, in the way of something that is both impulsive and certain. And she leaned into it for a moment, just a moment, before they both stepped back into the sensible territory of public behavior. On the ride home he said, "I want to say something and I want to say it correctly, so I'm going to take a minute," she said. "Take your time." He took approximately 30 seconds and then said, "I understand that you came here as an employee and that our arrangement is a professional one, and that your situation here depends on my employment. I understand that this makes certain things complicated and that there is an imbalance in the situation that I don't take lightly. I am not asking you for anything you are not free to give freely, but I would like to ask, with all of that understood, whether you would be willing to let this become something different." She said, "Something different as in what exactly?" He said, "As in courting, as in taking meals together not as employer and employee but as a man and a woman who are spending time together on purpose." She said, "We already take meals together." He said, "I know, I'd like to do it with intent." The wagon moved through the desert dark and the stars were ferocious overhead, and Dorothy was quiet for long enough that Thomas began to prepare himself for the possibility that he had misread everything, that the lean into his arm had been courtesy, that the conversations had been professionalism, that he had been seeing what he wanted to see. Then she said, "Yes, with intent." He said, "Good." She said, "But I want it to be clear between us." He said, "What specifically?" She said, "That if it doesn't work, if at some point either of us decides it doesn't work, I need to be able to stay. Not as what it was, but I need not to be pushed out of the territory with nowhere to go because a personal matter didn't work out." He said, "That's a fair thing to ask." She said, "I'm not saying it to be difficult. I'm saying it because it happened to me before in a different way, and I don't have the resources to recover from it a second time." He said, "Dorothy." And then, because he was not a man who said things lightly, he said her name again because it was the first time he had called her that and he wanted to mark it as something. "I would never put you out of a place you'd made yours. That's not in me. And I'd like to think whatever happens that you know that about me by now." She said, "I do know it, I just needed to say it." He said, "Say whatever you need to say, always." She said, "That might be a more significant commitment than courtship." He said, "Maybe," and he smiled. And she could see it even in the dark because she had learned his face, and she smiled back. And the wagon carried them home through the desert and the stars. Courting, it turned out, in the practical reality of a working cattle ranch in New Mexico territory in the winter of 1882, looked less like a formal arrangement and more like a deepening of everything that was already there. It looked like the conversations they were already having, but longer and more personal. It looked like Thomas finding reasons to be in the kitchen at the end of the day when she was finishing up, and like her finding reasons to ride out to where he was working in the afternoon when she had finished her morning responsibilities. It looked like him showing her the land. This was the part she had not been prepared for. He took her out on horseback, on Constance, on the weekend afternoons when the accounts were done and the household was settled, and he showed her Cielo Rojo the way you show someone a thing you love. He showed her the eastern creek, where the cottonwoods turned gold in November, and the sound of the water was the only sound in a landscape of absolute silence. He showed her the mesa on the northern boundary where you could see, on a clear day, 100 miles in every direction. He showed her where the deer came down in the evenings, and where the hawks nested in summer, and where his father had planted a stand of piñon trees in the early years, and they had grown slow and permanent against the hillside. He told her about his father, which he had not talked about to anyone since January. He told it simply, the way he told everything, without decoration, but it was clearly something that needed to be said and had been waiting a long time for the right person to say it to. His father had been a man of tremendous physical capability and tremendous emotional reserve, which Thomas had inherited, and they had been close in the way of men who do not say directly what they feel but demonstrate it through the work they do together, and the way they occupy the same space. The loss of him had left a shape in Thomas's daily life, a negative space where a person had been, and Thomas had been walking around that space for 10 months. Dorothy listened without interrupting, which was one of the things he had noticed about her early on, the quality of her listening, which was active and present, and did not turn the conversation back to herself before it was finished. When he was done, she said, he built something real here, it's still real. Thomas said, that helps, that thought that it's still here, she said. You should know that you're the reason it's still real. You're the reason it held together this year. He said, the accounts helped, she said. The accounts were a tool. You were the one who didn't let go. He looked at her and she was looking at the mountains, and the afternoon light was doing something spectacular to the landscape, as it did every afternoon in New Mexico, painting it in colors that still surprised her, and she was the most grounded and most real person he had encountered in a very long time, and he thought, with the simple certainty of a man who has learned to trust his instincts, that he was going to love her. Not in the future, not as a possibility, as a fact. He was already moving toward it, and there was nothing in him that wanted to stop. He said, Dorothy, she said. Yes, he said, I'd like to kiss you if that's all right. She turned and looked at him directly, which was something she always did, this head-on quality, and said, it's all right. He kissed her with the same quality as everything he did, careful and certain, and the horses stood patient in the November sun, and the desert was immense around them, and she put her hand against his chest where his heart was and felt it beating, solid and steady, and thought that she had been very wrong about the things she thought she needed and very right, in the end, about the things she trusted. December came, cold and clear, and brought a new set of challenges that Dorothy had not anticipated, and that tested both of them in ways that the previous months had not. The first challenge came from Myra Wells, specifically from a man named Charles Doyle, who was the owner of the general store, and also, Dorothy was beginning to understand, the nearest thing Myra Wells had to a social arbiter. Doyle was not a bad man, but he was a conventional one, and the convention he was most committed to was the appropriate arrangement of women in their proper categories. He had decided, apparently, that Dorothy occupied a category that was not quite right, and he had communicated this in the particular way of small-town conventional men, which is to say indirectly, and through his wife, who had mentioned to Margaret Finley at the church social in early December that people were asking what exactly the nature of Miss Sawyer's situation at Cielo Rojo was. Margaret had told him, with a calm and pleasantness that contained a great deal of sharpness underneath it, that Miss Sawyer was her son's intended, and had walked away before Mrs. Doyle could respond. Thomas learned about this from his mother and relayed it to Dorothy that evening on the porch in the cold, the quilt from the bent willow chair now over Dorothy's lap. Dorothy said, she said that, Thomas said, she said it. Dorothy said, without asking us. Thomas said, she's my mother. Dorothy said, what does that mean exactly, intended? Thomas said, in the context she used it in, it means we're planning to get married. Dorothy said, are we? Thomas said, I'd like to, if you're willing. She was quiet for a moment that was not a hesitant quiet but a thinking quiet, and he waited. She said, I came to New Mexico territory 4 months ago with nothing. I want you to know that I'm not saying yes because I'm afraid of having nothing again. He said, "I know that," she said. "I'm saying yes because this is where I want to be. This is the life I want. You and this land and your impossible mother and general sleeping outside my door." He said, "My mother will be glad to hear she's included." She said, "I'm saying yes, Thomas." He said, "Good," and took her hand, and they sat on the porch in the December cold under the enormous sky, and both of them were smiling. They married on the 14th of February, 1883, in the parlor of Cielo Rojo, because the weather made a trip to Myra Wells impractical, and because Dorothy had said she wanted to be married at home. The minister came out from town in a wagon Thomas had sent for him, and the ceremony was attended by Margaret, the ranch hands Miguel and Henry, who had worked at Cielo Rojo for years, and whom Dorothy had come to know well, the Archibald Webb and his wife from across the county who had become genuinely friendly in the months since the grazing rights deal, and General, who sat at Dorothy's feet throughout the ceremony and had to be gently moved twice. Dorothy wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from Santa Fe, a deep blue wool that was the same color as the mountains in the late afternoon. Thomas wore his good coat and had cut his hair, finally, and looked at her during the ceremony with an expression that was so openly loving that Margaret, watching from her chair by the window, had to look out at the mountains for a moment. The minister said the words and they said the words back, and Thomas kissed her in front of everyone with the quiet, certain quality of a man who means what he does. And Dorothy thought that she had traveled a very long way and through a great deal of difficulty to get here, and that it had been completely worth it. Afterward, Margaret served the wedding dinner she had spent 2 days preparing, and they ate and talked, and Henry played fiddle for a while, and Miguel sang a song in Spanish that he said was a wedding song his grandmother had taught him. And the evening was warm and lit by lamplight against the February dark, and Dorothy sat beside Thomas and felt the particular peace of being exactly where she was supposed to be. Later, after the minister and the Webb family had gone home and the ranch hands had gone to the bunkhouse and Margaret had gone to bed with a discretion that Dorothy recognized as a considered gift, Dorothy and Thomas were alone in the house that was now thoroughly, incontestably hers as well as his, and the fire in the front room was burning down, and she said, "I want to tell you something." He said, "Tell me," she said. "When I saw the quilt on the porch chair, your mother's quilt. 8 weeks after I arrived, when I still didn't know if I was wanted here, that was the moment I understood that this place could be home. Not because of the quilt exactly, but because of what it meant that she put it there, because it meant somebody was paying attention. Somebody was trying, even if they didn't know how to say it directly." He said, "I didn't know she did that." She said, "I know you didn't." He said, "That sounds exactly like her." She said, "I thought so too." He said, "She loves you in her way, which is not always the most direct way." She said, "I know, I love her too." He put his arm around her and she put her head against his shoulder, and the fire burned, and the desert was wide and cold outside, and she was warm. Spring came to Cielo Rojo with the particular ferocity of high desert spring, not gradual but sudden, the desert going from brown to green almost overnight with the rains that came in March, the wildflowers erupting along the creek, the cottonwoods going electric yellow with new leaves, the hawks returning to the northern mesa, the cattle expanding into the spring grass with the visible pleasure of animals in better conditions. Dorothy's kitchen garden expanded, as she had planned, and she added the corn along the eastern wall where the sun was longest, and planted tomatoes and squash, and more of the kitchen herbs she had been cultivating since her first weeks, and the garden became hers in the way that something becomes yours when you put your hands in it repeatedly and give it your attention. She and Thomas fell into the rhythms of the ranch together, in a way that was different from the professional arrangement of the previous autumn, because now it was unambiguously shared. They made decisions together, the large ones over the kitchen table in the evenings with the account books, the smaller ones in the natural conversation of people who work and live in the same place. She deferred to his knowledge of cattle and land and weather. He deferred to her knowledge of accounts and planning, and the management of complex arrangements. They argued sometimes, both of them people who had clear views and were willing to express them, but their arguments were always about the thing they were discussing and never about each other. Margaret watched them build this life with a satisfaction that was deeper than she had expected, possibly because she had not let herself expect it until quite recently. She had started in the spring to spend more time in the garden with Dorothy, and they had fallen into a kind of working companionship that was different from the careful relationship of the winter, but just as genuine. Margaret knew plants the way Thomas knew cattle, with the accumulated knowledge of decades, and Dorothy was a fast and interested student, and they spent long mornings in the garden talking about things that were sometimes entirely practical and sometimes quite personal. Margaret told Dorothy, one April morning while they were transplanting seedlings, about her own early years in Missouri, the years before they came west, the difficulty of them and the good things in them, and the way she had sometimes been so tired she had cried alone in the kitchen at night while her husband slept. She told it with the frankness of someone who has decided that honesty is more useful than dignity, and Dorothy listened with the quality she always brought to listening, and then told Margaret about her mother, who she did not talk about often, the fever and the loss of her when Dorothy was 11, the way it had made her into a particular kind of person, competent and capable and not always sure how to let herself be taken care of. Margaret said, "That quilt, I need you to know what was in it." Dorothy said, "You told me it was your mother's pattern," Margaret said, "and my husband's shirts and Thomas's baby clothes." "Yes. But what I mean is that I put it there because I wanted you to know you were in the family. Not as an employee, not as something temporary, in the family." Dorothy straightened up from the seedlings and looked at Margaret with eyes that were very bright and said, "I know," Margaret said. "I wasn't brave enough to say it out loud then." Dorothy said, "You said it," Margaret said, "not with words." Dorothy said, "Margaret." It was the first time she had used her first name and both of them noticed it. "It was the most eloquent thing anyone has said to me in my life." Margaret made a sound that might have been a laugh in a woman who was not Margaret and turned back to the seedlings, and Dorothy did the same, and they worked together in the spring morning and the garden grew. In early May, Dorothy understood that she was expecting a child. She told Thomas on a Sunday morning before anyone else was awake, out on the porch in the early light, and his response was the same as it always was when she told him something significant, which was that he went very still for a moment while he understood it, and then his entire face changed into something she had not seen many times but would never forget when she did. He said, "Are you well?" she said. "I'm well." He said, "Are you pleased?" She said, "Very." "Are you?" he said. "I don't have a word for what I am," which was the most effusive thing she had ever heard him say, and she loved him for it. He told his mother that afternoon, and Margaret sat down at the kitchen table and pressed her hand flat on it the way she did when she was feeling something large and said, "Good. That's very good," in a voice that was not entirely steady, and then she got up and went to the stove and started making something entirely unnecessary. The months of the pregnancy were long and good and sometimes difficult. Dorothy continued to manage the accounts and the household organization because these were largely sedentary activities, and she was not inclined to stop being useful. And Thomas watched over her with a care that was not excessive because he was not the excessive kind, but was simply present and solid and entirely reliable. He had always been reliable, but the reliability had a new quality now, warmer and more deliberate, the care of someone who knows what he has. They had conversations at night, in the quiet of the house when Margaret was asleep, that were the best conversations Dorothy had ever had with anyone. They talked about the child, about what they hoped for, about names, about the land and what it would mean to raise a child on it. They talked about Thomas's father, and about Dorothy's mother, about the people who were gone and who would be present in some form in this child through the shape they had given the people who remained. They talked about the future of the ranch and the future of the territory, about the Apache and Navajo peoples whose land this had been, and whose displacement was an injustice that Thomas spoke about with a seriousness she respected, the understanding of a man who had come to a land knowing full well who had been there before him, and who tried to hold that knowledge honestly. She loved him more, not less, the more she knew him. This was the thing that had surprised her most, because she had expected, having been deceived before, that proximity would reveal problems, that the daily reality of a person would diminish them. Instead, the daily reality of Thomas Finley continued, month by month, to add to him. He was more than she had thought in August. He was more than she had thought in November. He was, in May, deeper and more various and more consistently himself than anyone she had known, and she was building her life in the space of him, and it was the most solid structure she had ever inhabited. Their son was born in the last days of November, 1883, delivered by the doctor from Myra Wells, who had come out to the ranch the day before when Dorothy's labor began, and who was, it turned out, an excellent doctor in the particular unflappable way of frontier medicine. Thomas was present throughout, which the doctor considered unusual, and which Dorothy had simply stated was not negotiable. He held her hand through the hard part, not saying much because there was not much to say, but there, solid and real, and she was grateful for every minute of it. The baby was healthy and large-voiced, and had Thomas's dark hair and Dorothy's gray eyes, and a general disposition toward demanding attention that suggested he was going to be interested in life. They named him Robert James Finley, for Thomas's father, whose name had been Robert, and for Dorothy's father, whose middle name was James. Margaret, when she held him for the first time, was very quiet for a very long time. Then she said, "Robert, yes, that's right," and held him carefully, and Dorothy watched her and understood that something was being healed in that moment, something that had been a wound for 2 years, and she was grateful that she could witness it. Thomas sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his wife and his son, and the look on his face was the look of a man who has everything he needs and knows it, which is a look that is rarer than it should be. He said, "Thank you," she said. "For what?" he said. "For coming, for staying, for all of it." She said, "You're the one who placed the advertisement." He said, "Best thing I ever did," she said. "Second best. The best thing was your mother's quilt." He said, "I thought you said that was the most eloquent thing anyone ever said to you." She said, "It was. It told me I was home before I knew it myself." He reached over and took her hand, the baby between them small and perfect and loud, and Margaret sat in the rocking chair by the window holding her grandchild, and the lamplight was warm and the New Mexico night was vast and cold and brilliant outside, and the ranch was quiet around them, Cielo Rojo, red sky, the place where all of this had happened and would keep happening. The years moved forward the way years do when they are good ones, with a sense of the world being managed by people who are paying attention. The ranch grew steadily, not extravagantly, but in the sound way of something that is well tended. Dorothy's accounts expanded to accommodate the growth, and by 1885 she had taken on the additional responsibility of a correspondence arrangement with 2 other ranches in the county whose owners had heard, through Archibald Webb, that she had a talent for the financial organization of agricultural operations, and she was being paid for this, modestly but genuinely, which mattered to her in the specific way that independence always mattered to someone who had once lost all of it. Thomas, watching this enterprise develop, was entirely supportive in the way he was supportive of everything she did, which was to say practically, and without unnecessary comment. He built her a proper desk in a corner of the front room that became her office, and he made sure the household was quiet during the mornings she needed for concentration. And when she came to him with the results of her work, which were consistently good, he said exactly what he thought, which was that she was remarkable and that she should keep going. Robert, growing toward his 2nd birthday in the winter of 1885, was a child of considerable personality, serious like his father and direct like his mother, and utterly charmed by the natural world around him in a way that seemed almost innate. He had been fascinated by the horses from infancy, and Thomas had started teaching him their names and habits with a patience that Dorothy sometimes stopped to watch, because the sight of Thomas with their son was one of her favorite things in the world. Margaret was, by 1885, more herself than she had been since before her husband's death. She was not the same as she had been before. Loss does not work that way, but she was present in a new way, more willing to be glad, more willing to say what she felt, more likely to laugh at unexpected moments. She and Dorothy had become, over the 2 years of Dorothy's time at Cielo Rojo, something that neither of them had had before, something that was not quite mother and daughter because they were both too formed and too independent for that, but that was real and warm and mutual. They disagreed sometimes, both of them having clear views, and agreed to disagree with the civility of people who respect each other too much to require consensus. Margaret still brought the quilt in from the porch chair when the nights got very cold, and hung it back out in the morning when the weather permitted, and it had become one of the textures of Cielo Rojo, one of the things that was simply there, simply part of the place, the way the bent willow chair was part of the place, and the fruit trees were part of the place. Dorothy had made a practice of sitting in that chair on quiet evenings, with the quilt over her lap, looking at the mountains in the last light, and this had become her particular ritual, the thing she did when she needed to feel solid in herself. In the spring of 1885, Dorothy told Thomas she was expecting again. This time she told him at breakfast, with Robert on Thomas's knee eating corn mush with aggressive enthusiasm, and Margaret at the stove with her back turned in the way that meant she was listening to everything. And Thomas looked up from the child and looked at her with that still quality he had and then smiled. And Margaret turned from the stove and said, "I thought so," which Dorothy found extraordinarily characteristic. Their daughter was born in November of 1885, exactly 2 years after Robert, which seemed to Dorothy to be evidence of some kind of cosmic organizational principle. She was smaller than Robert had been and quieter, with Dorothy's coloring and Thomas's eyes, and an expression of watchful assessment that started when she was approximately 4 days old and never really stopped. They named her Clara Margaret, Margaret's mother having been a Clara, and the pride on Margaret's face when she was told was the kind of uncomplicated happiness that is itself a gift to witness. Thomas, holding his daughter in the first hour, looked at Dorothy over the baby's head with an expression she had come to understand as the one that contained everything he did not have words for, and she looked back at him with the expression she had developed in response, which was the one that said she understood, and that it was enough, and that she felt it too. The life they had was not without difficulty, because lives are not without difficulty, and the territory of New Mexico in 1885 was not without difficulty. There were hard years with the cattle and hard years with the weather, and one very bad year in 1886, when a prolonged drought burned the spring grass and cost them more in feed than they had budgeted for, and Dorothy spent 6 weeks reworking the accounts with a focus that was tiring and necessary and ultimately successful. There were conflicts with neighboring operations over water rights along the creek, which Thomas navigated with the firmness and fairness that was his characteristic approach to opposition. There were difficulties in town, the ordinary friction of a small community's opinions, which Dorothy handled with the calm directness that had become her trademark, and which mostly resulted in people deciding to respect her even when they had not planned to. Thomas's old injury, a break in his left wrist that had not set quite right in the year before Dorothy arrived, began to trouble him in the cold winters, and Dorothy learned to notice when it was bad by the way he carried his arm, and by making sure there was always the remedy the doctor in Myra Wells had suggested close at hand. She did this without making it a matter of observation, which he appreciated, because he was the kind of man who did not want to be watched in his vulnerability, but accepted care when it was offered quietly. They had a third child, another son, born in 1888, named William after no one in particular, but because it suited him. He was the loudest of the three and the most sociable and the most interested in everything immediately beyond his reach, which kept everyone occupied. Robert, by this time 5 years old, was clearly going to be a rancher, which Thomas had not required or expected, but which gave him a particular quiet pleasure. Clara at 3 was clearly going to be whatever she decided to be, which was the only prediction you could make about her. William at birth was clearly going to be a great deal of work and enormous fun. In 1889, New Mexico Territory was working toward statehood, an aspiration that would not be achieved for more than another 20 years, but that was already changing the character of the region, bringing new settlers and new capital and new complications. Dorothy followed these developments with the focused interest she brought to anything that affected the economic and social landscape of the place she lived in, and she and Thomas had long conversations about what statehood would mean for the ranch, for the territory, for the communities that had been here long before either of them arrived. She had learned, in the years since her arrival, a great deal about the landscape she inhabited, not just its physical beauty and agricultural demands, but its full history, the Pueblo peoples and the Apache and the Navajo, the Spanish colonial history, the years of conflict and displacement that had shaped this land before Anglo settlement reached it. Thomas had always spoken of this with honesty, and the children were growing up with a more complete picture of the land's history than most of their contemporaries, which Dorothy considered important. She taught them herself primarily, because the nearest school was in Myra Wells, and the trip was too long for daily attendance. She had not stopped being a teacher when she stopped being paid for it in Abilene. She taught reading and arithmetic and history and geography with the same precision and engagement she had brought to the Abilene schoolroom, plus the additions of everything she had learned since, including the natural history of the Sonoran Desert and the High Plains and the Rio Grande watershed. Robert was a steady and thorough student. Clara was a quick and argumentative one. William was a chaos of enthusiasms. Margaret had started teaching them Spanish, which she had learned from their ranching neighbors in the valley, and which she said was more useful in New Mexico than anything else Dorothy was teaching them, which Dorothy pointed out was itself a lesson in geography, and Margaret said, "Exactly," with the satisfaction of someone who has won an argument by agreeing. The December of 1889 was the coldest in the memory of the oldest residents of the county, and the ranch was locked in by a storm for 11 days, which was longer than any storm Dorothy had lived through, and which required the careful management of resources she had always kept in good supply precisely, because she had learned from the territory's unpredictability. The animals were housed, the food stores were sufficient, the firewood was adequate, and the 11 days, which might have been a crisis, were instead a long, enclosed, winter-lit stretch of time that Dorothy later thought of as one of the richest of her life. Thomas mended harness and repaired equipment in the barn during the days. Margaret taught Clara and William to play the card games she had learned as a girl in Missouri. Dorothy worked through the accounts for the coming year, and read, and made soup from the stores in the cellar that became, over 11 days, more elaborate and more delicious as she experimented with what was available. Robert, at 6 years old, spent his time between the barn with his father and the kitchen with his mother and grandmother, and became, over those 11 days, the particular kind of child who is comfortable in both worlds, the practical outdoor one and the warm indoor one, and this seemed to Dorothy to be very good news for what kind of man he was going to be. In the evenings they were all together in the front room, the fire high and the lamps lit, and they played games and told stories, and Margaret sang songs from her Missouri girlhood that she normally kept to herself, old songs, some of them, that her own mother had sung, and the sound of her voice in the fire-lit room was something Dorothy did not expect and would not forget. Thomas, one of those evenings when the children were finally asleep and Margaret had retired and they were alone by the dying fire, said, "7 years ago I was sitting in this house alone and the quiet was too much." Dorothy said, "I know." He said, "I would not have predicted any of this." She said, "No." "Neither would I," he said. "Are you happy?" She said, "Thomas, I am so happy it frightens me sometimes." He said, "Don't be frightened of it." She said, "Habit." He said, "Old habit." She said, "Very old habit." He reached over and took her hand in the way he did, certain and unhurried, and she turned her hand to hold his, and the fire burned down to embers, and outside the snow was still falling on Cielo Rojo, on the orchard and the garden and the bent willow chair on the porch and the mountains in the distance, and everything was quiet and everything was theirs and everything was right. The quilt was inside on those cold nights, because Dorothy brought it in when the temperature dropped below what was reasonable for leaving it outdoors. She kept it in her and Thomas's room, over the back of the chair by the window, and it was the last thing she looked at before she slept, and the first thing she saw in the morning. She had told Thomas the full story of it in the first months of their marriage, what it had meant to find it there, what it had done to her in that moment on the porch in October of 1882, the way that one small and unspeakable kindness had cracked something open in her that needed to be cracked open before she could let the rest of it happen. He had listened and then he had said, "I'll tell her." She had said, "She already knows." He had said, "She deserves to hear it said." And he had told his mother, not the same day but a week later, in the garden when Dorothy was inside and Margaret was among her fruit trees. And Dorothy did not know what he said to her exactly, but she saw them through the kitchen window, standing together in the afternoon light. And Margaret had her hand pressed over her mouth in the way she had when she was feeling something large, and Thomas's hand was on her shoulder, and Dorothy had stood at the kitchen window and been very quiet and very grateful. Margaret Finley lived to 71, which in the territory of New Mexico at that time was an excellent age, a long and full one. She died in the spring of 1901, on a morning in April when the fruit trees were in blossom, quietly and in her own bed, with Dorothy on one side and Thomas on the other, and the windows open to let the orchard smell into the room. She had been slowing down for 2 years but had remained herself, opinionated and precise and capable of great warmth expressed through unconventional means, until nearly the end. Dorothy sat with her through the last night and thought about quilts and porch chairs, and the ways people find to say what they cannot say directly. She thought about the woman who had been cool and careful and frightened, and had gotten up before dawn to arrange a piece of herself on a chair for a stranger, and what that act had cost and what it had given. She thought that the bravest thing she had ever seen was not any of the obvious brave things, the frontier hardships and the weather and the long years of uncertain work. The bravest thing she had ever seen was a woman who was afraid and did the kind thing anyway, who reached past her own fear to let someone in. They buried Margaret in the small cemetery on the ranch, beside her husband, under a piñon tree, as she had specified, and the spring went on around them, the way the land always does, requiring attention and returning what you put into it. Dorothy was 37 years old that spring, and she stood at the graveside with Thomas beside her and their 3 children around them, Robert 17 and growing into a young man of serious capability, Clara 15 and already more interesting than most adults Dorothy had known, William 12 and still a contained hurricane, and she thought that she had a life so full that it pressed against the edges of her chest. She thought about the woman she had been in Abilene in the summer of 1882. Nothing. She had had nothing. She had answered an advertisement. She had packed 2 trunks and taken a train and a stagecoach and arrived in a territory she did not know, at a ranch she had never seen, to work for a man she had never met, on the basis of 3 weeks of letters and a quality of writing she had decided to trust. And there had been a quilt on a porch chair, and here she was. In the years that followed, the Cielo Rojo ranch continued to grow and change and endure. Robert, at 20, began to take on real operational responsibility, and Thomas began the process, gradual and deliberate, of teaching his son what his own father had taught him about the land. Dorothy's accounting practice had expanded to the point where she had a real correspondence business, serving several ranches and 2 small businesses in Myra Wells, and she had hired a young woman from town to help her copy documents, which brought her the particular satisfaction of being someone's employer under good conditions. Clara, at 18, went to school in Santa Fe, which was the subject of the most significant argument Dorothy and Thomas ever had, because Thomas's instincts were protective and Dorothy's view was that a girl who was that intelligent deserved every available education. And Dorothy won the argument on the merits and Thomas admitted she was right, which was one of the things she loved most about him, that he admitted when she was right. Clara thrived in Santa Fe and came back summers and brought books and ideas, and a very direct way of talking about the world that she had always had but which had grown more assured with education. And the kitchen table conversations in the summers when Clara was home were some of the most interesting Dorothy had ever been part of. William, in his turn, turned out to be less of the chaos and more of the contained energy she had suspected was underneath it all. And by 16, he had developed a specific gift for working with horses that exceeded even Thomas's considerable skill, and he had plans for a breeding operation that Dorothy had gone over with him in detail and found to be genuinely well conceived. Thomas, at 50, was still lean and capable and weathered in the way of the desert, and still looked at Dorothy across the table with the same quality he had had at the wagon in November of 1882, that look of something certain and warm that she had never once taken for granted because she knew what its absence felt like and did not intend to forget. She still sat on the porch in the evenings with the quilt over her lap and looked at the mountains. She had done it for 15 years, and she did not intend to stop. The bent willow chair had been repaired twice and had a new leg at the back that Thomas had made from wood he carved himself on a winter evening, and the quilt had been washed carefully and mended where necessary, and neither of them would ever be new again, but they were real and they were hers. She would sometimes take the quilt between her hands and look at the hexagonal patches, the rust and the cream and the deep blue, her mother-in-law's pattern and her husband's father's shirts, and the remnants of what Thomas had worn as a baby, all of it together in one piece, and she would feel, with a fullness that never became ordinary, the weight of everything that had been given to her and the rightness of having received it. She had been left with nothing. She had come to a porch chair in the desert. She had been given a quilt by a frightened woman who pretended it had always been there, and it had. In the way that all the things that are truly yours have always been there, waiting for you to arrive. The evening star came out over the mountains, and the desert cooled, and inside the house Thomas was helping William with something. The sound of their voices, a low, comfortable register through the window, and somewhere in the kitchen the smell of supper was building. And General's grandson, an enormous black dog of uncertain ancestry named Captain who had appointed himself Dorothy's dog the moment he was old enough to understand what that meant, was sleeping at her feet. And Dorothy Sawyer Finley pulled the quilt tight around her shoulders and watched the sky go from orange to deep blue to the first pure black of evening, and the stars came out one by one and then all at once, and the world was quiet and the world was full, and the world was hers.